Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Banker's Pianist Bride. Chapter 1. The last few notes died away in the breathless hush that filled the room, and Cora Reed bowed her head over her hands in her lap. For a long moment, she sat in utter stillness, hardly even breathing, while she waited for what always came at the finale of her performances. Sometimes, it started as a ripple. Other times, a smattering. Tonight, at this poignant appearance, it erupted all at once, as though the hearts and minds of the 100 men and women in the audience were moved to show their appreciation in unison. The applause was not there one moment and simply appeared the next, seemingly designed to raise Cora and her fellow musicians to their feet. The violinist took his bow, the man at the bull fiddle did as well. Cora alone sat with her head down, refusing to look up and see the evidence of the adoring audience. Perhaps if she had done this more often, she thought resentfully, she would not be in this predicament. Mr. Connor, well, evidently, he preferred it when females knew their place. In her heart, though, she knew that there was no true way that she could have avoided this situation, no true way that she could have managed to keep this from being her last performance at the West Street Music Hall. Her fate had been signed and underscored from the first moment that Mr. Connor stopped by to investigate the possibility of purchasing the business from the previous owner, the kindly if rather doddering Mr. Richards. Mr. Richards had hired Cora when she was 16, after a deft display of her talent at the Ivories, and had never given her a moment's trouble about anything. She had known from the first sight of Mr. Connor that he was a different breed entirely, decades younger than Mr. Richards. He was yet somehow far more old-fashioned, and the idea of a lady performing her talents on stage, especially alongside gentlemen musicians, was outrageous to his sensibilities. No, Mr. Connor had decided at once that she must go. She had seen it in his eyes, in the small distasteful pinch of his mouth, and her heart had sunk to her boots. Cora was not a native of the city. She had been born and raised in a small town to the north by 10 miles, and it was only after the death of her parents that she had come to New York to make her fortune, or, as her practicality admonished her, simply to make a living. That was all she asked. But here she was, 25 years old, with no experience apart from playing the piano for the past decade or so, and no prospects either. As kindly as Mr. Richards had been, he kept her very busy, and she had scarcely even time to make friends, let alone keep new employment on the horizon. And now she had not even her current employment. This was her last performance, and now that it was over, she might never see a piano again. Fighting back tears, determined not to let Mr. Connors see the effect his decision had had on her, she stroked the ivory keys for the last time. The sound of her erstwhile employer's voice made her look up. Connors had joined his musicians on stage, and along with him was a rather snively-faced young man that Cora had spotted earlier, lurking backstage. "My dear, dear friends," Connors boomed, "I'm delighted to announce to you that as of tomorrow night, we will welcome my nephew, Andrew Connors, as the newest member of our talented troupe. He will take his place at the piano, and I'm sure a more skilled set of hands you'll never have seen in your life. So please, my dear friends, do return tomorrow. Tickets are being sold even as we speak, so feel free to collect yours at the door on the way home." He glanced toward Cora, but his eyes did not even see her, only the piano at which she's Saturday, and perhaps, to whet your appetite, a brief performance by this virtuoso young man. He shepherded Andrew Connors toward the piano. Stung and half in disbelief that he would replace her with such ruthlessness, Cora scarcely had time to leap from her seat and stumble backwards toward the wings before Andrew Connors was being set down firmly on the bench. The young man gave an ingratiating grin in the direction of the audience, squinting in the footlights, and then lifted his hands to the ivories. Cora watched in shock as the fellow began to play. It was a slaughter, she thought in horror. How anyone could make such a mess of the piano, and such a mockery of Joplin, was beyond her comprehension. She had not been replaced just by a man, but by a man with no musical skill or inherent talent whatsoever. But, a man, nonetheless. Mr. Connors was waiting for her after she collected her things from the cloakroom. He handed over the envelope containing her final night's pay and gave her an unctuous grin. "Goodbye, Miss Reed. Best wishes in your future endeavors." She snatched the envelope from him and gave him a steely glare. "I don't suppose you mean a word of that, Mr. Connors, except perhaps goodbye." "Humph," said the music hall owner, sniffing with distaste. "I might venture to make a suggestion, Miss Reed. Music ought not to be in your future. Stick to professions more befitting a woman, take work as a maid, perhaps, or as a governess. Pursuits more becoming to a female." Oh, how she longed to speak back to him, to put him in his place as he had so endeavored to put her in hers. But there was nothing she could say, not without losing her temper. And she had come close enough to that as it was. All she could manage, with her tone strictly controlled, was, "I wish your nephew well, Mr. Connors. It is my dearest hope, which I'm sure the audience shares with me, that one day he will learn to play the instrument instead of attacking it." Unable to trust herself not to say anything more pointed than this, she hurried past Mr. Connors, who was fortunately too aghast at her insult to his nephew's prowess that he could say nothing in return. Moving swiftly, Cora found herself emerging into the back alleyway behind the music hall and took a deep breath of the thick summer air. It was quite late in the evening, already almost 11, and yet a pale light lingered in the air from the prolonged sunset. It was well past her bedtime, and she was alone on the street, alone in the world, she amended rather bitterly, and had nothing to her name except a frighteningly small savings and a roof over her head, at least, for the next 2 weeks, until the rent was due. The only skill she had was her deft touch with the piano, and yet, that talent was pointless, to hear Mr. Connors tell it. Would any other music hall impresario hire her on? Did she have the moral courage to even ask? Desultorily, she set off on the long walk home. New York had once been the destination of her dreams. All she had wanted in life was wrapped up in its promise. And now, at 25, she found that she was jobless, nearly penniless, and without a family to call her own. There was nothing and nobody for her here in the city. How she longed for a fresh start. Somewhere far away from the scene of her shame and rejection. If she were a man, she thought, she would hop on a train bound for California and join the myriads headed there to pursue their fortunes in prospecting gold. Of course, if she were a man, she wouldn't have lost her employment as a pianist to begin with. She heaved a sigh, wrapping her shawl around her more tightly, though the chill she felt was more psychological than any result of the temperature. The city never seemed to cool off, even late at night, in the summer months, but it was cold-shouldered enough to a woman alone. She wasn't a man. She couldn't go to California and become a prospector. It didn't even seem feasible that she could go anywhere at all, without someone to meet her at the far end of the journey. The thought of striking out on her own, without a destination in mind, was frightening. She'd done it before, but she had been younger then, and the future had seemed so full of promise. Oh, how she wished she could sense that promise again, waiting for her just over the horizon. But there was nothing around the corner, now, except more of those empty New York streets. At the head of the street, on a slight rise, she stopped and looked out at what she could see of the city. Even now, a few candles burned in windows, but the world was dark. It was a perfect encapsulation of New York, she thought, too dark to perceive the light she could bring with her music. But there was no use arguing her case. It was just an empty street. Somewhere deep within, she found the resolve that had seen her through so many hard times in her young life. She would find somewhere else and start over, she promised herself. She had no instrument to carry with her, but she had her fingers and her talent wherever she went. She would pack up her things, choose a destination, and start anew. In the darkness, she whispered the promise to herself. Somehow. Chapter 2. Cora stared around her with wide eyes, feeling the urge to pinch herself and determine if this was really all a dream. How was it possible that a mere 2 weeks before, she was packing her things in New York, and yet here she was, disembarking at the station in Cheyenne, Wyoming, to wait for the next train west, the train that would take her that last leg of the journey to Pinecrest, in the heart of the Idaho Territory. And what waited for her in Pinecrest but a husband, ready-made? She smiled and shook her head. It really did seem impossible. Why, scarcely a month had gone by since she'd played her final performance at the West Street Music Hall. Scarcely a month since she had found her way home and collapsed into bed, too tired to even think about the next day and what it might hold. And scarcely a month since she had come across the advertisement in the newspaper, the very next morning after Mr. Connor's dismissal, asking for a brave and kind woman to travel to Pinecrest, Idaho, to marry the manager of the local bank, Mr. Leroy Harrison. She hadn't thought twice about it. It had seemed little short of a gift from above. Oh, yes, it had cost her the last of her savings to secure the train tickets, but that would be more than made up for when she arrived in Pinecrest, she was certain. From the sound of it, Mr. Leroy Harrison was respectable, well-to-do, and looked up to in his community. It didn't matter much that he was a good bit older than her, it just meant, she was certain, that he wasn't likely to be as flighty as some of the young men she'd met at the music hall. The idea of marriage had seemed far-fetched. She'd had her music, what need had she for anything else? But the more she thought about it, the more she liked the idea of being a wife, of having a husband to care for and provide for her. And perhaps, someday, a family, little ones, whom she could teach to play the piano. She could picture them, one big happy family, all gathered around the piano in the parlor at Christmas, playing the old familiar songs. It was too easy to daydream, and detrimental to do so while walking through unfamiliar streets, as she found out when she bumped headlong into a rather harried-looking young woman. "Oh, dear. I am sorry." The other girl leapt back and gave a cry of irritation. Clutching a hand to her chest, she burst out, "After everything I'd been forced to deal with, and now this, too." Cora blinked at her, taken back. I really am very sorry. It's entirely my fault, I wasn't paying attention to where I was going." She chuckled faintly, hoping to lighten the other woman's mood. "I was daydreaming, I suppose. That ought to teach me." The other girl gave a testy sigh but seemed to relent. "Oh, it's not all your fault. I was moving too hastily myself." "Has the train east left yet?" Cora shook her head. "I don't believe so. There's nothing at the station now. I'm waiting for the next train west, myself, and the nice porter told me that it should be here within 2 hours." "I loathe the idea of waiting another 2 hours," said the other girl, tight-lipped. "But I suppose, if I must," she folded her arms. "Any measures that it takes to get out of here." Despite the young woman's rather off-putting mood, Cora's sympathy was stirred. "I'm sorry that you're forced to wait. You appear rather upset. Is there anything I can do to help? I'm not from around here, myself," she added quickly. "I'm only passing through." "Where to, and where from?" "Why, I came from New York City, actually." "New York," cried the girl, clutching at Cora's sleeve. "Why on earth would you leave somewhere like that?" Cora couldn't help but give a rather confused smile at this abrupt change in demeanor. "Well, it's quite a difficult place to live for a girl on her own. I haven't any family, and, well, I've agreed to an engagement with a man in Idaho. I'm on my way there, now." The girl's eyes widened, and she gave a huff of disdain. "An engagement? Do you know the fellow?" "No," Cora had to admit. "We've only corresponded twice." "Well, my dear young lady, let me tell you about engagements to men you've never met. They're a terrible idea, that's what." Cora glanced around her, suddenly feeling as though she wanted to escape the conversation, but at a loss for how to do so politely. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she managed at last, and stuck out a hand. "My name is Cora Reed, by the way." The young woman shook it brusquely. She seemed, at least, to have gotten over her initial irritation with Cora, and to have moved on to a general sort of irritation with the world at large. "Addie McMaster," she said, "of Tucson, Pennsylvania. Are you returning home, Miss McMaster?" Addie's lip curled. "I am," she said. "And the first thing I'm going to do when I get there is march into that matrimonial office and give them what for. I know a thing or two about arranged engagements, Miss Cora. They matched me with a farmer in Nevada. A rancher. Ha. The only thing he was growing was tumbleweeds, and he expected me to live in a shack that was hardly large enough for a dog, and he already had 3 of those. She shook her head with such vehemence that Cora momentarily feared she would fall over. I told him thank you kindly, but I had no intention of being the wife of a poverty-stricken fellow who couldn't even grow his own corn. And I'll say precisely the same thing to the agency once I'm safely back in Tuhone. Cora, herself a woman of rather strong emotions, found that she had met her match in Addie McMaster's wrath. I'm sorry about that, she said helplessly. It sounds terrible. Miss McMaster seemed to refocus on her. If I were you, Miss Cora, I would get on the train east along with me and count yourself well rid of your engagement. Matrimonial agencies ought not to make such matches without ascertaining the facts. I didn't apply to a matrimonial agency, Cora ventured. I answered an advertisement in the paper. Addie threw her hands in the air. Even more cause for worry, she said. Yes, you'd better come back with me right away and save yourself the trouble. She slipped her arm through Cora's and took one determined step toward the train station, where the train heading east was just now puffing to a stop. Cora planted her feet firmly, refusing to be pulled against her will. I appreciate your concern, she said, but I do not share your certainty of disaster. Addie McMaster dropped her hold on Cora's arm and stared at her. For the first time, Cora realized that the two of them were strangely similar in many particulars. Both young women, both traveling alone, like Cora. Addie even had red hair, though Cora's was closer to auburn. And they must have been similar ages, too, Cora thought with a faint chill. Was it possible that Addie's fate would be Cora's, too? Are you absolutely sure? Yes. I'm sure. The fellow may not be at all what he claims to be, Addie warned her, and even less likely that he will be what you were daydreaming about. You might very well arrive there in the territories and find that he's not someone you want to marry at all. Cora shook her head. That will not be the case for me, she said. I'm certain of it. Addie gave her a doubtful look. So, you may say, she said. And I hope it's true, but the fact is, Miss Cora, none of us are given any guarantees when we decide whom to marry, now, are we? Even if we know the fellow. And how much more so when we agree to an engagement to a stranger? She shook her head, as though bemoaning Cora's decision, or, indeed, the fate of women in general. I hope, for your sake, that you are right, and I am wrong. Thank you, Cora said, mustering up a smile. I hope so, too. Addie twisted her mouth to the side. But I sincerely doubt it, she said. The train gave a long, hooting whistle. With one last inquiring look, to which Cora shook her head, Addie McMaster turned to race for the station, leaving her poor match behind at last, and leaving Cora, for the first time, to confront the doubt in her heart. The next few hours passed swiftly, as she explored the streets of Cheyenne, never venturing too far from the station in case the train should arrive early. By the time it did, and she was back aboard, seated and as comfortable as one could be on a train, her heart had steadied, and her resolve had grown. She would not be like Addie McMaster. She would not arrive in Pinecrest and judge Mr. Leroy Harrison to be unworthy of her hand. She had agreed to marry, and marry she would, no matter what sort of man he turned out to be. Drifting into a daydream again, she allowed the motion of the train to lull her into slumber. The hours passed by even more swiftly after that, more swiftly than the landscape rolling by outside the window. When the train jolted to a stop, she jolted awake in turn, frowning in confusion. Where are we? She said aloud, still somewhat befuddled from sleep, for of course there was no one near her to answer. But a call from the conductor brought her to her feet. Newton, Idaho, next stop Franklin, Oregon. I'm sorry, sir, she called, hastening to the end of the car to call after him. Did you say next stop Oregon? He nodded back at her, tipping his hat. But I'm to go to Pinecrest, Idaho. The conductor rubbed his chin and gave a faint shrug. I reckon you'd better get off the train here, now, miss, and arrange for a ride. The train tracks don't run through Pinecrest. He chuckled. Not much does, as a matter of fact, apart from maybe some wild horses. Pinecrest is a good 15 miles north of here. She stared at him, aghast, until he went on his way, calling the news aloud once more. The train gave a whistle, and she jolted herself into action, scrambling back to her seat to find her things and leave the train before it headed further west. What a shock to realize that she had still further to travel before she reached her destination. 15 miles. How on earth was she to manage it? She hadn't the money to hire a wagon, let alone a horse, and hadn't the knowledge to drive even if she'd been able. 15 miles, she thought despairingly, was an awfully long ways for a young woman to walk, especially carrying a valise and a carpetbag containing all her worldly possessions. But upon stepping foot on the wooden platform, she rallied her courage and took heart. 15 miles was a long way, yes, but it was far from impossible. It was early in the morning, and she had the whole day ahead of her. The skies were clear and cloudless, apart from the few clouds gathering over the faraway mountain range to the north. But surely, they would pass. It was the middle of summer, after all. It would be difficult, but she had never been the sort of woman to back down from a challenge. She would take the bull by the horns and, well, she would do her best, at any rate. As she began to climb down the steps to the ground, she realized that there was hardly anyone around. This town seemed to boast little in the way of buildings. It was little more than a waypoint for the train, evidently. But there was someone there, someone who seemed to be waiting with purpose. Purpose and a wagon drawn by two handsome gray horses. As she watched, intrigued, the driver of the wagon swung down from the box and came toward her. He was only a few feet away when he took his hat off and revealed himself to be dark-haired, dark-eyed, and as handsome a man as she had ever seen. He gave her an easy smile, and she felt her heart flutter a little. Suddenly, all the uncertainty she had felt melted away. She had 15 miles to go, yes, but she was going to do them in company. For this, she was certain, must be Leroy Harrison himself, come to collect her and see her safely along the last part of her arduous journey. She had been a fool ever to doubt, no matter what the Addie McMasters of the world claimed. She found herself smiling as he came to meet her and held out a hand eagerly. "Hello," she said. "I am Cora Reed." He took her hand, his own was calloused and warm. Even a bank manager, she thought, must be hard-working in a place like the Idaho Territories. Meeting her gaze, he smiled again. "Welcome to the Territories, Miss Reed," he said. "I'm Will Thompson. Mr. Harrison hired me to collect you." Chapter 3. Cora felt her heart begin a slow but steady crash in the direction of her feet. Mr. Harrison was awful busy with the bank, YC, Will Thompson went on cheerfully, apparently unaware of Cora's crisis of conscience. "I didn't have anything particularly pressing to do today, and he reckoned that his time would be better spent at his place of business, and mine would be worse spent in the saloon." He grinned. "And I reckon he's right. Is this all your baggage, Miss Reed? Come along with me, and we'll get you comfortable in the wagon." Wordlessly, Cora did as she was told and allowed him to hand her up beside him in the driver's box, though she felt the impulse to shrink from his touch. She had been so certain that he was the man she was engaged to. Now that she had a chance to look at him more closely, of course, she could tell that he was not in his 40s, as Leroy Harrison was reputed to be. No, he couldn't have been more than 30, which made him a scant handful of years older than she was. He was tan from time in the summer sun, his shirt sleeves rolled up above the elbows, revealing musculature that she certainly shouldn't have expected from a bank manager. On the whole, she knew she had been rather foolish. Too eager to anticipate that the man she was engaged to marry had come to greet her at the station, 15 miles away from his very important job at the bank in Pinecrest. She heaved a sigh, and the man beside her sent her a concerned glance, brow furrowed. "All right, there, miss?" "Oh, yes, I'm fine, thank you. You were very kind to come and fetch me on Mr. Harrison's behalf." "Oh, it's no bother at all. A fine bright day like this, it does a man good to get out of Pinecrest for a jaunt." He turned his sunny smile on her again, and she forced herself to look away. He noticed it, but, to her relief, evidently put it down to something else. "You must be exhausted after that long trip." Now, don't let me talk your ear off. Just watch the countryside go by, and I'll try to get you to Pinecrest as soon as can be. He twitched the reins in his hands and whistled. Hi up, Beau. Hi up, Butte. Let's get Miss Reed home at the double. It was true that she was tired, and she was grateful for his consideration. Still, as they rolled along, she couldn't seem to stop herself from asking him questions now and then, about the flat bowl of the valley that they were in, the mountains in the distance, what she could expect when they reached Pinecrest. Will Thompson answered easily, with no apparent strain even though they were strangers. It really felt, she realized suddenly, as though they had known each other for some time, rather than only a matter of an hour or two. He even readily divulged some details about himself. He owned a small ranch just outside of town, inherited from his father. He was, he confessed without embarrassment, a bit on the lazy side. The ranch runs itself, really, which is just about ideal for a fellow like me. I like to spend time with friends, go fishin' in the pond when I get a chance, stop in at the Eagle's Eye and pass the time of day with whoever happens by. A few chores here and there and a cattle drive once or twice a year. Hard to imagine a better life than the one I've got. And I suppose you share that wonderful life with your wife and family, she ventured. He shook his head, but just as cheerfully in his negation as with anything else. No wife, no family, he said. Never seemed to get around to it. Well, that's not much of an excuse, is it, for someone like me? He laughed. Truth is, Pinecrest is awful small, and there aren't many girls there. It's a town full of old folks and bachelors, by and large. I reckon that's why Mr. Harrison published that advertisement in the papers back east. He wasn't likely to find a girl who met his standards anywhere here in the territories. His standards? She asked, frowning, but Will Thompson shot her a swift glance, seeming to calculate what he ought to reply before he set the words loose. Oh, he's the most highly respected man in town, he said at last, still in that same cheerful tone. Don't know what the good folks of Pinecrest would amount to without Mr. Harrison to show us what could be accomplished. He comes from out east himself, you know. Not New York, I don't reckon, but somewhere big. Boston, Philadelphia, somewhere like that. A city man, and city-minded. He keeps us on our toes. He laughed again. I reckon without men like Mr. Harrison, Pinecrest would be nothing more than a bunch of lazy good-for-nothings. Just like me. She suspected that his words were meant in jest. A man couldn't run a business like a ranch and truly be considered lazy, could he? But in comparison to his high praise of the bank manager, well, perhaps that was the key. Perhaps everyone paled in comparison to Leroy Harrison. She tucked the thought away for later and redevoted her attention to her surroundings, so very different from anything she had ever seen. The wide, open plains, the purple mountains, the enormous dark thunderhead that seemed to be moving closer with every passing moment. Mr. Thompson, she said, dubiously, I don't suppose that could possibly be. He nodded, his eyes on the sky. I've been watchin' it for a while now. All storms start over on that ridge over there, Cloudbreak Ridge, they call it. I'd hoped we would be able to outrun it, but from the looks of things, he glanced at her. I'm afraid we might get a little bit damp, Miss Reed. Here, you'd better take this lap rug and put it over your head. Maybe it won't be too bad, after all. But the summer storm seemed determined to prove him wrong. It felt as though the clouds were chasing them, even as Will Thompson urged his pretty gray horses on to faster speeds. Cora wrapped herself in the lap rug as best as she could, even though it smelled a little bit like a horse, and watched with wide eyes as the landscape turned into twilight in the middle of the afternoon. The first visible streak of lightning appeared, and she yelped as it was swiftly followed by thunder. The next thing she knew, a sheet of rain hit them like an ocean wave, and she found herself huddled up against Mr. Thompson, seeking what little protection she could manage. He put an arm around her and held her close, though the touch was impersonal. Hang on, Miss Reed, she heard him yell above the din. He called to the horses, and they responded, moving ever faster. We're almost there. And thus it was that, eyes squeezed shut against the storm, clutching the shirt front of a handsome stranger with both hands, Cora Reed made the last leg of her journey to the town that held her future. True to the nature of such weather at this season, the storm passed almost as swiftly as it had come on. They rode out of the rain and into bright sunshine. Sitting up and taking the lap rug from around her head, Cora was surprised to find that the landscape, which had been so empty, was now dotted with houses here and there. Directly ahead of them was the town proper. As Will Thompson pointed out helpfully, Pinecrest was little more than a collection of streets, and a small collection at that, but it was obvious that her companion took great pride in it. "There's the mercantile," he said, nodding toward one large building as they rolled past. "And there's the feed store. The saloon, I reckon that's just about my favorite spot in town. Buck Hawley's the owner. He's a good fellow, runs a clean establishment, hardly any fights at all. They're bringing in a piano soon, too." He beamed. "Pinecrest is moving up in the world." "A piano?" Cora's attention could not help but be arrested by the dear, familiar word. She craned her neck to look back at the saloon, but it was already disappearing as Will Thompson turned the corner. "And right up here is the First National Bank. It's nearly 6 o'clock, I reckon just about everyone's gone home by now, but Mr. Harrison'll be there, never you fear. Always more to be done, he says." And just like that, the drive was over. As Will Thompson handed Cora down, she couldn't help but reflect on how swiftly it had gone, and yet, it had been several hours since she had first met Will. He held her hand for a moment, smiling down at her. "I enjoyed your company, Miss Reed." "And I yours," she said, smiling back. Impulsively, she added, "Will you call me Cora? I suppose I ought to start making friends as quickly as I can in my new hometown." He nodded. "A sound piece of advice, always make friends wherever you can." "I'd be honored to be your friend, Miss Cora." "And you'll call me Will, won't you?" "I will, Will." She smiled despite the fluttering in her heart, and he chuckled. She was still staring up at him when the sound of someone clearing their throat rather vehemently caught her attention, and she spun around, dropping his hand as though it burned her. There, just outside the door to the bank, stood the man she knew beyond doubt, knew with all certainty, to be Leroy Harrison. She could never have taken him for anything but a bank manager. He wore a rather severe black suit, and a rather severe expression to go with it. His dark hair, speckled with gray at the temples, was combed severely back. In fact, she realized, she might have guessed his profession to be only one other thing shy of a bank manager, and that was an undertaker. For all that, he was quite handsome, as well as distinguished. And a smile appeared on his face now as he came forward, hand out to take hers. With determination, she stepped forward and allowed her hand to be swallowed up in his. It was soft, there were no calluses. "Miss Reed, at last. I had begun to wonder whether you might not have met with some mishap on the way, as I see you have, indeed." He looked her up and down, and with a blush she realized that she must look more than a little haggard, after the long journey and the brief summer storm. Her auburn hair was trailing tendrils escaped from her hairpins, her dress was still soaking wet and spotted with mud from the wheels and horses' hooves, and overall, she must have presented a rather frightful appearance. But as she caught the note of disappointment in his eye, a feeling of resentment built up in her chest. After all, she had traveled here because of him, not on a whim of her own. The least he could do was to give her some credit for that fact. "I'm afraid I'm a bit of a mess," she said. "I'd very much like the chance to wash up and rest, Mr. Harrison, if that is possible." The disappointed expression disappeared, but she guessed that it was the result of an effort on his part to be polite. Of course," he said smoothly. "Allow me to take you to my home, Miss Reed. Everything is prepared." He glanced over her shoulder at Will Thompson. "Thank you, Will, that will be all." His tone was so peremptory that it sounded like little more than a snub. After all, Will wasn't his servant. Cora turned her shocked face from the bank manager to the admittedly laid-back rancher and was even more surprised to find that Will Thompson didn't appear to be the least bit perturbed by his dismissal. In fact, he gave her a smile as he waved acknowledgement at Leroy Harrison. "Right you are, Mr. Harrison," he said. "Goodbye for now, Miss Cora. I'm sure I'll see you around town. Pinecrest is too small to avoid me, you know." Despite herself, she found a smile creeping across her lips. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Thompson." He grinned back. The pleasure, he said, was all mine. Chapter 4. The proprieties, as Leroy Harrison hastened to assure Cora, were all observed. Yes, she would stay with him in his home, which was located not too far away from the bank itself. A modest but tidy house, 2 floors, with a spare room upstairs and another small nook off the kitchen that his housekeeper Mrs. Patchett usually slept in. And Mrs. Patchett will serve us admirably as a chaperone, he told her. Everyone in town knows that she's irreproachable in her moral fiber. Even so, I wouldn't venture to make such arrangements if not for the fact that we have no other option. There's no call for an inn in a town the size of Pinecrest, and the boarding house shut down last year for lack of clientele. I would rather have you safe and sound in the sanctity of a public house, believe you me, Miss Reed, if for no other reason, the fact that as the manager of the Pinecrest's bank, my reputation must remain unassailable. Cora thought that her own reputation deserved a little consideration, too, but Leroy was carrying on without waiting to elicit her opinion. At any rate, we'll marry in a month's time, just as soon as some business at the bank is completed, and then any potential cause for discussion will be laid to rest. In the meantime, Mrs. Patchett will take the spare room upstairs, down the hall from my own, and she's generously agreed to let you sleep on her cot off the kitchen. It was generous indeed, Cora thought. The cot was just that, little more than a straw mattress a foot off the floor, and there was hardly enough room in the nook to turn around, not to mention no source of light apart from what candle she brought in with her in the evening. But the rest of the house was hers to roam, and the bed was comfortable enough. She was too tired to even think about complaining and felt rather fondly toward the cot as she fell into it that evening after a decent supper. The next morning, she arose earlier than she would have liked, awakened by the sound of Mrs. Patchett crashing pots and pans together on the other side of the thin wall. It was clear, upon Cora's emergence from the nook, that the elderly housekeeper didn't mean anything personal by it, for Cora was greeted with a friendly if toothless smile and an offer of a cup of coffee. Within half an hour, she found herself ushered into the dining room to take a seat to the right of Leroy Harrison, who presided over a long, empty table with the air of a man who was preparing a speech to thousands. His smile was friendly enough, at least. "Good morning, Miss Reed. I trust you slept well?" "Like the dead," she said frankly, and chuckled at herself when he raised his eyebrows. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison." "Yes, I slept very well, and very deeply. The journey seemed to have tired me out more than I realized." "You do look refreshed," he said politely. Cora wondered whether he meant it in comparison to her appearance the day before. After the ride through the rainstorm, she had washed, brushed, and put on a clean dress that morning, her auburn hair tucked up into place once more, and she had no doubt that she only loosely resembled the harum-scarum figure that he had first met on the evening previous. She smiled, a bit self-consciously. "Thank you," she murmured. He turned his attention to the plate before him. "I hope you don't mind that I eat and run," he said. "I have a great deal of business to attend to today, bank business, you know." "Of course. Feel free to make yourself at home, both here and in town. In other circumstances I would not advise a young woman to wander on her own, but Pinecrest is absolutely beyond any hint of danger. Why, in the 4 years that I've lived here, I have yet to see any reason for the county sheriff to so much as visit. Though of course when he does, he comes to supper at this very table." He smiled to himself. When a man is in the bank business, as I am, it behooves him to have the ear of the law. "I should think it would be even wiser to have the arm of the law," Cora said. "It must be rather difficult to apprehend criminals with one's ear." He smiled, but she suspected that he didn't really mean it. "Well, that's just the point, my dear Miss Reed. There are no criminals in Pinecrest, and if myself and Sheriff Jones have anything to say about it, there never will be. I suppose you'll be able to keep yourself occupied for the day?" "Oh, certainly. I don't mind wandering, I'd like to get to know the town." "That will be easily done. It's not a very big town. Not like our cities back east." "No," she agreed. "But what I've seen of it thus far has been charming. I'm certain that I'll be able to keep myself out of mischief while you attend to business." The thought of music, never very far from her mind, struck her. Mr. Harrison, there isn't, by chance, a music hall or anything of the sort in the county? I'm sure Pinecrest is a bit too small to support one, but perhaps in the county seat. She didn't need a verbal response to know that she had made some sort of faux pas. She needed only to look at the frown on his face. A music hall? I should hope not. Cora frowned right back. They aren't all dens of iniquity, Mr. Harrison. I played in one myself, back in New York City. I was the pianist. His eyebrows shot upwards, and she realized that she must never have broached the subject with him in their letters. Which was not too terribly surprising. They'd had a chance only to exchange two before she had agreed to come to Pinecrest. With a sinking heart, she couldn't help but suspect that if she had told him this tidbit of news before his offer of marriage, she likely would not be sitting here at his table. A piano player. Yes. I was quite good. But he was shaking his head, evidently without care as to her skill at her instrument. No, Miss Reed, that would never do. Not here in Pinecrest. Not when you're engaged to be married to the bank manager. I'm afraid that my position demands that I maintain utter respect among my fellows, Miss Reed, and to have a wife who attends music halls, let alone performs in them, the very thought makes me shudder to my core. She was frowning more heavily than before, she knew it, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. It was certainly not what she wanted to hear from the man she was engaged to marry. Perhaps, she thought vaguely, if she'd heard it before she bought her ticket, she wouldn't be sitting here at his table. And yet, she had a responsibility to him now. She'd agreed to marry him and promised herself that she would not be the sort of girl who changed her mind at the drop of a hat. She would stay true to her word, even if her engagement wasn't perfect. The least she could do was try to understand his point of view, and hope that he would do her the same honor in turn. I'm sorry, she said after a moment, keeping her voice calm and pleasant. I didn't mean to make you shudder, to your core or otherwise. It's a simple statement of fact that I was a pianist, Mr. Harrison, that and nothing more. I can't change that about my past, I'm afraid. He took a deep breath and nodded. Somehow amid all of this he had finished his breakfast, she wasn't sure how. It was like a magic trick, there one moment and gone the next. Perhaps he had inhaled it. I agree, Miss Reed, nothing about the past can be changed. Only the future still remains to be altered, and I hope, I very much hope, that the two of us can concur on such important matters. I am, after all, to be your husband. My position in Pinecrest, and at the bank especially, is very important to me. I hope that it will be equally important to you. And what of the hope that she had harbored, that she would marry a man who understood her passion for music? She bit back on the words before she could speak them. It would never do to start out the day with that sort of disappointment. Besides, Leroy Harrison was standing up, depositing his napkin on the table. I'd better be on my way now, Miss Reed. I do hope you have a pleasant day, and think on what I've said. He gave her a rather stern expression by way of parting smile, and she sat for a long moment by herself at the empty table, thinking, and fighting off the sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. At last, tossing her head, she stood up and left the dining room, stopping only to snatch her shawl from her little cubbyhole of a room before she went out into the summer morning sunshine. It was another beautiful day, with only the hint of clouds on the horizon. She took a deep breath of the fresh air. Air was different here in the Territories, somehow, in a way she could not quite put her finger on. It made her feel as though tingles were running through her, over and over again. With Mr. Harrison's reprimand put firmly from her mind, she determined that she would enjoy the day. Wandering the streets was agreeable to her soul as well as to Mr. Harrison's sensibilities. She set out to wander with a vengeance. What little she had seen of the town the evening before proved to be the blueprint for the rest of it. The buildings were all remarkably similar, made of rough-hewn timber, all whitewashed and tidy, rather blinding in the sun. Each establishment had a painted sign denoting what it was. Johnson's Mercantile took up nearly an entire block. Henry Blake's feed store wasn't too far from it, and up there on the next block was. She stopped dead, gaping, hardly able to believe the testimony of her eyes. But it was true. There was, indeed, a piano in the middle of the street. Evidently, it was in the process of being delivered. The wagon that it had been brought in on, prominently painted Murdoch and Sons musical instruments, waited nearby, with a patient horse in the harness. The horse, she thought, was likely simply glad to be rid of its burden. The men to whom the horse, the wagon, and the piano belonged were nowhere to be seen. As she came abreast of the neglected instrument, she realized suddenly that it had been left outside the Eagle's Eye Saloon, Buck Holly, prop. Well, that explained it. They had made it only so far with moving the piano before their thirst beckoned them to duck into the piano's ultimate destination, leaving the instrument to bide its time in the broad outdoors. She shook her head, smiling, and on impulse ducked inside herself. It was still relatively early in the day, scarcely 11 o'clock, but there was a small group of men clustered around one end of the bar. All of them had pints at hand, and all of them turned to look at her. "Can I help you, miss?" She came forward. "Are you Mr. Buck Holly?" The man behind the bar abandoned his fellows and his glass and came toward her, nodding. "I am." Cora took a deep breath, fearing briefly that her courage would fail her. "That must be your piano outside, then." "It is." He nodded. "We're the first saloon in the county to have a piano as fine as that delivered to our door." "A beautiful instrument." "It is lovely," she agreed fervently. "I couldn't help but admire it, and couldn't help either but wonder, Mr. Holly, what arrangements you have for it to be played." "It's just that, if there aren't many pianos in Pinecrest, I would venture to guess that there aren't many pianists either." He raised one eyebrow. "Oh, now, miss, don't you worry about that. We'll be hirin' a piano player within the next few days, I reckon. There's a fellow from over Roebuck way, Gregory Jackson. He'll be glad enough to play on the Saturdays. You tell your fellow to bring you in, if you'd like to listen." Another deep breath, and she let the words spill from her without thinking. "I could play it for you, Mr. Holly." He blinked at her. She had the attention of the other men, too, she realized. "I beg your pardon, miss? I performed in a music hall back in New York City. I'm quite good. And I live here in Pinecrest, not over in Roebuck like Mr. Jackson. I could play more than just Saturdays." Buck Holly turned to glance back at his fellows, who gave him shrugs and grins. When he turned back to Cora, he gave her the same treatment. "Well, that's awful kind of you to offer, miss, but, well, it's a rare thing to have a woman play in a saloon. Matter of fact, I'm not sure how the patrons would feel about it. But there's no telling until you try," she argued, already feeling that the point was lost. "Maybe so, but I'd rather not risk it, all the same. Pinecrest is a small town, miss, and we're an old-fashioned lot. I reckon you'll find that out once you've spent more time here." With a final apologetic smile, he turned back to the other men, and Cora turned to go, her shoulders bowed. Surely, if he would just take a chance on her, if she could convince him that she was worth the risk. The piano, shining softly in the sunlight, seemed to give her the idea as clearly as though it had called her name. Hardly realizing what she was doing, she stepped up to it in the middle of the street, heedless of the dust on her boots. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys. It sounded sweet, as though it had been born to be played there in the sunshine. Without a bench, it was a bit awkward, but she wasn't about to let that stop her. She bent her knees a little, settled herself poised in place, and began to play. At the first burst of music, she garnered the attention of the handful of people who were passing by. Most just glanced at her and carried on, but as a few stopped to watch her, more joined them, and before she had reached the middle of her chosen piece, she was nearly surrounded by appreciative watchers. At the back of her mind, she vaguely noted that the swinging double doors to the saloon had been thrust wide, and Buck Holly and his companions were watching, too. But that was a small consideration. Now, with the keys at her fingertips, she gave herself over to the pure enjoyment of playing. Cora had never been a natural at memorizing music, preferring to read from the sheet as she went, but the old familiar tunes from the music hall came back to her nearly note for note, and what she could not remember precisely, she filled in with flourishes. It made for an unusual and striking performance, the young woman at the piano in the middle of the street, pouring her heart into her fingers and her fingers melding with the keys. At last, too soon, she reached the end of the melody and stood up, unable to stop a wide smile. The audience around her burst into rapturous applause, and she laughed, giving them a self-effacing little curtsy, which brought on more applause and a few whistles and cheers. Among the watchers, she realized with a little jolt to her heart, was Will Thompson. He gave her a knowing grin as their eyes met, and when she did not look away, came forward, still clapping. "So, this was what was on your mind, when I mentioned the saloon was gettin' a piano. You never said you were a virtuoso, Miss Cora." "I'm hardly that, Will. I do so love to play, though," she confessed, her emotions rather overwhelmed. "And I can see why. I reckon anyone would love to do something they're good at. I may not know much about music, but I would guess you're better than most. Say," he glanced toward the saloon. "Buck hasn't secured a piano player yet. Would you?" She shook her head. "I already asked him. He turned me down flat." Will frowned in consternation. "Well, he can't possibly stick to it, not after a performance like that. Come on, Miss Cora, you're better than anyone I've ever heard." He took her arm with a frank familiarity that made her smile and marched her along with him to where Buck Hawley and his fellows stood just outside the saloon. Cora stood tall as she could manage, with her 5 feet 2 inches in height, and lifted her chin. There was no need to speak first, she told herself. Best to let Mr. Hawley comment. And, after a long moment in which she could practically see him chewing it over, that was precisely what he did. "That was quite a performance, Miss Reed," Will put in promptly. "Miss Cora Reed, of New York City. A gem, Buck, you've got to admit it. Why, if she was playing in your fine establishment, I'd visit every day." Buck Hawley raised an eyebrow. "I reckon we see you every day anyhow, Will." "Sure," Will said with a grin, "but I'd be there for more than supper and a pint. This is entertainment, Buck, and you know it'll draw the masses. Just look at this mass right here." With his free hand he gestured around them at the crowd, most of whom were still watching avidly. Hawley made a thoughtful face as he looked around, then his eyes focused on Cora once more. "You'll play 5 days a week," he said. $1 a day. Saturdays to be left for Greg Jackson. First moral complaint I get about a woman playing, that's it. $10 a week, Will said promptly. Buck Hawley stared him down. "You her manager now, Will?" "A concerned friend, that's all." "Come on, Buck, the saloon brings in enough to stand her $10 a week, easy. And there'll be more where that came from when folks get wind of her playing." Hawley squinted at them both in the bright sunshine. $7 a week and she can keep whatever tips she gets, he said. And a free glass of beer every night, and one for her manager, too. Will laughed, and the tension that had fairly vibrated between them suddenly seemed to ease. There was another smattering of applause from the watchers, who finally turned to go, contented with the happy ending. Feeling rather ecstatic, Cora turned to Will, and had to clamp her arms down at her sides to stop herself from flinging them around his neck in a grateful embrace. "Oh, thank you, Will. Thank you, Mr. Hawley. You won't regret it." Buck Hawley waved the thanks away. "I'll regret that $7, he said. "Now, move along, Miss Reed, and let these fellows bring the piano out of the sunshine." Chapter 5. It was fully Cora's intention to tell Leroy Harrison about the goings-on at the saloon, but she had also intended to keep it secret for a while first. After all, she reasoned, what he didn't know couldn't hurt him. She would begin playing at the saloon the next afternoon and return home before he did. Arrangements had been made, and Buck Hawley approved of them. He was an old-fashioned man and liked the idea of the little woman returning home to eat supper with her fellow, even if they were not married yet. Cora did not mention this detail to him. He seemed to believe that she was the wife of some unknown Mr. Reed in town, and she hated to disabuse him of this notion until necessary. And it would be, someday, but in the meantime, if she could just play for a while before reality had to come crashing down on them all, she knew it would feed her soul and strengthen her spirit. But she never got the chance. It was the very next morning, as she sat down at the table next to Leroy, that she knew something was terribly wrong. "Good morning," she said, giving him a smile. He returned the venture with a sour stare. Is it, Miss Reed? Cora stared back. Well, it was until a moment ago, anyway. Is something wrong? With a testy sigh, the sound of a man who has been loaded with a burden far too heavy to bear, Leroy put his napkin down on his still full plate. Now, Miss Reed, he said, turning to her and lacing his fingers together in front of him with the air of a preacher about to deliver a sermon to a wandering sheep, I really would hope that you had the courage and forthrightness to speak to me directly, without prompting. No one had ever accused Cora of lacking forthrightness, but courage, she thought, came and went. On what subject, Mr. Harrison? On the subject of playing instruments that I have expressly forbidden, in public. Out of doors in broad daylight, no less. Cora's mind ran wild. Evidently, some of the watchers the day before had either seen fit to report her doings to her husband-to-be, or, more likely, he had overheard talk of the impromptu performance. Regardless of how it had happened, the cat was out of the bag now. She resisted the urge that told her to inquire as to whether her piano playing would be more acceptable if it had been indoors in the dark. I'm sorry, she said. I've longed to play ever since I left New York, and I suppose the temptation was too great to overcome. It was only one song. I shouldn't think that matters in the scheme of things, Miss Reed. I expressly told you that playing the piano was not the sort of thing that a bank manager's wife should be known to do. There's nothing wrong with my playing the piano, she returned hotly. Plenty of women play the piano. It's a skill that is in high demand for entertaining on long winter evenings. They teach it at finishing schools. Perhaps, yes, but long winter evenings and summer afternoons in front of a crowd are not the same thing, Miss Reed, not the same thing at all. I know, she said, relenting a little. But we spoke only about my playing in music halls, Mr. Harrison. Music halls, out on the street like a common busker. Hardly a common busker, she couldn't help but object. Not many are able to haul entire pianos around with them, after all. And certainly, I should hope you have no idea of playing that very same piano in the saloon itself. Cora opened her mouth to tell him exactly what her idea was, and then closed it again with a snap. Telling him her plan, she suspected, would only lead to further ire, and he was already as red as a beet. Without her input, he carried on regardless. Performing in a saloon would be even worse than doing so in a music hall. Such places are rife with bad behavior and questionable virtue. Goodness, Miss Reed, if you won't stop to think of your own reputation, kindly do me the favor of thinking of mine. I beseech you. Cora did not think that Leroy Harrison was doing much in the way of beseeching. His words were not a request, but a command. She stared at him for a long moment and took a deep breath. Mr. Harrison. Before she could carry on, he sighed and reached out to take her hands in his, to her surprise. I'm terribly sorry I've lost my temper, he said. I suppose I do have strong feelings on the subject, and perhaps you'll agree, when you've had a chance to think about it, that they do me credit. It sounds awfully selfish of me, I know, but in truth I'm just as concerned about you, my soon-to-be wife, as I am about myself. I hold a certain place in the minds of the people of Pinecrest, and as my wife, you will naturally hold the same place. I want everyone to have you on a pedestal, Miss Reed, a veritable pedestal. The corners of his mouth drooped. Isn't that what any loving husband should want for his wife? Cora wasn't entirely sure about this, but she could not deny that his tone was contrite, his words soothing. A sympathetic woman at heart, she found herself responding in kind. I don't want to cause any damage to your good name, Mr. Harrison, truly I don't. I only wanted to play the piano. I miss it, I suppose, more than I even realized. It was one of the chief joys of my life, ever since I was a girl. She bit her lip, full of reminiscent fondness for that long-ago time in her life. My mother took in mending, and one of her customers was an elderly lady who couldn't see to thread her needle. But she could still play and had a piano in her sitting room. Mother offered to mend her clothing for free in exchange for lessons. I often think that I got quite the better end of the bargain. She trailed off, suddenly aware that Leroy Harrison wasn't paying attention to her story. His eyes were fixed on her, but there was a blankness to them that suggested his mind was far from attentive. She sighed. I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison, might we use our first names? If we're going to be married, surely it can't be improper. Leroy Harrison looked dubious at this, but after a moment he nodded. He even smiled. Yes, of course, my dear, Cora. Thank you, Leroy. It's difficult to get to know someone if you must call them Mr. all the time. It constrains relations, I think. Said Leroy Harrison, without agreeing or disagreeing with this opinion. Well, Cora, perhaps we should leave the subject at that. I must be off. Bank business to attend to, you know. Of course. She watched him as he stood to leave the table, then hesitated. Try not to get in too much trouble, he requested. Despite herself, Cora had to hide a smile. I'll do my best, she promised. He paused a moment longer before nodding and turning to go. She knew the cause of it, too. It wasn't much of a promise, when she had already inadvertently caused their first argument after only arriving in town 2 days before. But really, if a man could be so upset over her playing the piano in the middle of the street, well, she couldn't help but figure that any disagreement was as much his fault as her own. The day stretched ahead of her, another fine, hot summer afternoon waiting just around the corner. She busied herself with tidying up in the house, as much as Mrs. Patchett would allow, and then took herself off for a walk through the town after luncheon. If the pattern that Leroy had set thus far was going to continue, he wouldn't be home from bank business until near sundown. She had several hours to while away before then. It was just her luck, of course, that she ran into Will Thompson almost immediately, emerging from the mercantile. Why, hello there, Cora. I was just about to head out to the saloon for a late lunch. I half expected to see you there already. She gave him a half-hearted smile, fighting the urge to put her whole heart into it. It surely was wrong, the way his handsome face made her heart flutter. I'm afraid not, Will. I won't be coming. Would you explain to Mr. Hawley on my behalf? Will scratched the back of his neck doubtfully. I guess I could, if I understood it myself. What happened? She shook her head, trying to choose her words carefully. It would never do to spill everything about the conversation she'd had with Leroy that morning, the words that were said, the way he made her feel, and above all the way she had felt inclined to criticize him in her head. No, Will was the last person who should be allowed a hint that there was trouble in paradise. I've just changed my mind, that's all. Now, that don't seem too likely, Miss Cora, Will said, raising an eyebrow. I don't know you well, I admit, but I think I've got the measure of you even so. I saw the look on your face as you played that piano, and heard the sounds you coaxed out of it, too. Well, all right, I do love to play, but Mr. Harrison and I had a discussion on the subject. His brow cleared. Ah. And, she went on, feeling rather defensive now, he gave me his opinion, and I gave him mine, and together we agreed that playing the piano in a saloon might not be the best representation for the bride-to-be of a bank manager. After all, there is such a thing as inherent dignity. Will said, with a nod. Such a thing as a stick in the mud, too. Cora stared at him, clamping her lips together to battle the laugh that inadvertently rose to her lips at his comment. Will blushed suddenly. I'm sorry, Cora. That was rude of me, and I shouldn't have said it. He did not say, Cora couldn't help but note, that he didn't mean it, just that he shouldn't have said it. Mr. Harrison is a good man, and worthy of respect. His hard work for the bank has rendered it a place of dignity, and I reckon he feels he ought to wear dignity the same way he wears his 3-piece suits. Can't blame a fellow for wanting to look the part. He looked so anxious for her forgiveness that she couldn't withhold it from him. Thank you, Will. I'm still getting to know Leroy. I trust your judgment that he is a good man, and I'm sure that there is more to him that I must discover. As, I'm certain, he will soon find out more about me in return. Will nodded. If Mr. Harrison thinks you oughtn't to play at the Eagle's Eye, then I wouldn't want to do anything to stand in the way of the two of you and any decision you make, he declared. You're a smart woman, I knew that right off the bat, and determined, too. You'll make your own decision on what's right and what's wrong. Yes, I will, she said softly. Will's easy grin made a slow return. "But it's a shame to think that you might not play anymore," he said. "I don't reckon Mr. Harrison will be too quick to purchase a piano of his own, but, say, there's a piano at the schoolhouse. It's been sittin' gatherin' dust for too long, and I reckon it'll need a little repairin', but it's there." Regretfully, she shook her head. "Thank you for the suggestion, Will, but I'd better not even consider it until I get to know Leroy a little better." "You're sure?" "Pearl is the teacher, Pearl Andrews. She's a friend of mine, and I know she'd be glad to let you." Cora was still shaking her head, and Will trailed to a stop. He gave a shrug. "Well, like I said, you'll make your own decision on what's right and what's wrong." He gave her a smile, and she knew there were no hard feelings despite her rejection of his suggestion. There were, however, a few soft feelings to contend with. "Leroy, he said. She smiled back. "Yes. Leroy." Will chuckled. "Look out, Cora," he said. "Sounds like you and your groom are movin' fast. First an engagement, then usin' each other's Christian names. What's next, holding hands in church?" He gave her a wink and a teasing grin, and she tried to stop her blush from overtaking her as he walked away. Tried, but, she had to admit, without marked success. He did seem to have the uncanny ability to make her feel strangely warm all over. Chapter 6. Life began to settle into a bit more of a routine for Cora, and she decided that, on the whole, she liked it. Mornings and evenings were spent with Leroy, usually seated at the dining table and listening to him discuss bank business. He gave her no details, apart from overarching praise regarding the modern approach to everything from loans to security. Despite the littleness of Pinecrest, the first national branch that had been established there was one of the most productive and highly used in the whole of the territories. Folks came from all over the county and even outside it to bank there, and Leroy considered this a personal compliment. Cora didn't begrudge him this pride. As far as she could tell, it was honestly earned. She did, however, grow a little bit tired of hearing about it. The remaining hours of each day were her own to do with what she would. This largely involved making herself familiar with the town. One by one, she stopped in at every place of business, introduced herself to the owner and any other workers, and explained who she was and why she was there. It was a way to pass the time, to be sure, but she also was quite gratified to find that, when she and Leroy went on post-supper promenades in the long summer evenings, almost as many people greeted her by name as Leroy himself. The rather surprised way he looked at her made her smile. There was pride in his eyes then, too, and she knew it was because of her. Perhaps their marriage would not be so estranged after all, if she could manage to make him proud of her. One afternoon, when she had been there for nearly a week, her walking route took her close by the bank. She had, by this point, grown to be familiar with most faces in town. Pinecrest was rather small, after all, so it was not much of a feat, but the two men who stood outside the bank, watching it with cold yet avid interest in their eyes, were unknown to her. She slowed as she walked past them, watching them curiously. One, his hat pulled low over his eyes, turned to watch her in return. She saw a small smile curve up the edges of his lips, and she turned away hastily. There was something about that smile she did not like. Thus far, Pinecrest had been remarkably free of any overtly negative interactions, or people who made her nervous. It was markedly different from New York for just that reason, and Leroy's claim that his adopted hometown had no crime or criminals seemed to be founded at least somewhat on fact. But there was something unnerving, off-putting, about the strangers who stood in the street near the bank. She glanced over her shoulder as she turned the corner, just in time to see a third man, had also drawn low to obscure the top half of his features, come out of the alleyway beside the bank. He joined the first two and they began to converse in tones so low as to be inaudible to anyone but themselves. Feeling strangely unsettled, Cora made her way to the general store. Matthew Johnson, the owner, was a kindly old man who always had a ready smile for her, and she felt better as soon as she set foot in the familiar surroundings. "Well, hello there, Miss Cora. Have you got a list for me today?" She advanced on the counter, smiling, and handed her shopping list over to him. One of these days, Mr. Johnson, I'll learn where everything is in your fine establishment, and find my things for myself. But, of course, I've only been here a week. Has it only been a week? Seems as if you've always been here, Miss Cora. Can't imagine the town without you. He gave her a wink and turned to begin gathering her purchases. With a self-satisfied sigh, Cora meandered through the aisles to browse while she waited. She was thumbing through the short stack of novels in the corner when the conversation the next aisle over caught her attention. My Henry said that they'll never be caught. They're too smart, they always choose the exact right location, at the exact right time. But no one can be that smart, said another voice, reasonably. There's not a gang in history that doesn't make a mistake now and then. I'm sure that striking here in Pinecrest would be just that mistake. Would it, Sue? Would it really? But Pinecrest never has any incidents, argued a third. Not like other towns. Take Roebuck, for example. They did, said the first. They took it right when the sheriff wasn't looking. And that's just the key, Adelaide, for you're correct that Pinecrest never has any incidents. But that very fact is what keeps Sheriff Jones' attention elsewhere. And while he has no need to come here, that makes it the perfect place for the outlaws to pounce on. Really, Mary, you do sound too dramatic. They're a gang of bank robbers, not a group of cats. Frowning, Cora rushed around the corner to step into the conversation. I'm sorry, ladies, but I couldn't help but overhear. Is there some talk of a bank robbery? The three women stopped and stared at her. Cora stared back at them frankly, waiting until one of them spoke up. They were vaguely familiar to her: Mary Blake, the wife of the man who owned the feed store, Adelaide Montgomery, the wife of the local chimney sweep, and Susan Hickory, the wife of, well, Cora had to admit that she didn't know that Susan Hickory was anyone's wife. They were all three a decade or two older than Cora herself, and it was clear that they did not consider her a peer, as a young, unmarried woman. It's just that, she went on at last, when it appeared evident that she wasn't going to get a response, I am engaged to be married to Mr. Harrison, the bank manager, and... All at once, it was as though the three women were a river bursting through a dam. Oh, of course. I knew your face was familiar, my dear. We have not yet had a chance to meet, but I've heard all about you. How clever of Mr. Harrison to write for a bride who met his exacting standards. Now, don't you worry about a thing, Mary Blake told her, cutting across the other two in sweeping tones. It's just a rumor, more than likely, that there's an outlaw gang heading our way. Nothing ever happens in Pinecrest. Well, that's just it, Cora said. I couldn't help but notice a few strangers in town. But you're a stranger myself, my dear, Adelaide said, patting her on the arm. Of course you wouldn't know everyone just yet. Cora frowned. Well, My dear, I must ask you something now, before it goes out of my head, put in Sue Hickory hastily. I hear that you are a marvelous piano player. Now, have you ever considered teaching the children of the town to play? There is a piano at the school that is going sadly unused, and I'm sure that many of our mothers would adore to have their little girls learn to play the instrument. Cora had been determined to pursue the subject of a potential bank robbery, but this idea sent her attention off in a different direction entirely. She blinked in surprise. Why, thank you for your compliment, Mrs. Hickory, that's very kind. No, I confess I had never thought of such a thing. And why not? She asked herself. It was a wonderful idea. And surely Leroy couldn't object to her playing in front of innocent children. Why, it was practically foolproof. Perhaps you should consider it, said Mary Blake kindly. Training fine young minds in such a delicate skill would certainly be a worthwhile occupation. And you could charge 50 cents a week for lessons, put in Adelaide with enthusiasm. Cora stifled a laugh at the outraged look that Mary Blake and Sue Hickory turned on their hapless companion. I'm sure such a consideration wouldn't enter my mind, she said, knowing it was far from true. I would simply enjoy teaching, that's all. Sue Hickory beamed at her. I thought you might, she said. I feel that I know you already, Miss Reed. I must admit, when Will Thompson suggested that you might make a wonderful piano teacher for the little ones, I was a bit skeptical, but now that I have had the pleasure of speaking to you in person, I can see precisely what he meant by it. Cora opened her mouth, closed it again, and finally managed to control her voice. Will Thompson, she said. It was his idea, then? Oh, yes, but of course, it would never do for a bachelor to go about telling a young bride to be what she ought to do with her time. I told him as much, and assured him that if it was appropriate, I would suggest the plan to you myself. She smiled widely. And as you can see, it is more than appropriate, it is ideal. Cora didn't pay much attention to the rest of the conversation after that. Her heart was too full of the idea of Will Thompson, his ready smile on display, speaking to others about her, his mind on her, finding ways to encourage her to pursue her passion. For the piano, she amended the thought, sternly. Her passion for the piano, of course. The thought was foremost on her mind as she sat down to supper with Leroy later that evening, and she was hardly able to force herself to wait until after he said grace before she burst out with it. To do him credit, he allowed her to speak her piece before he picked up his knife and fork, said, "No," and began calmly cutting his slice of beef. Cora blinked at him. "I beg your pardon, Leroy?" "No, Cora, I don't believe that teaching children to play the piano is, as you call it, a wonderful idea." Another moment, while she tried to wrap her mind around this unreasoning blankness. "But why not?" He set his silverware down and gave a patient sigh, which was somehow even worse than an impatient sigh would have been. "Because, my dear, it all comes down to the question of reputation. But it isn't as though I'd be playing in public, let alone in a music hall or a saloon. You can't seriously object that the homes of the town children are rife with bad behavior and questionable virtue. Of course not. Nearly every family home in Pinecrest is a model of chastity and moral excellence. The Lord would not allow them the privilege of becoming parents, otherwise. Then why? You, Cora, are to be the wife of the bank manager." "The bank manager," he repeated, stressing the idea unnecessarily, in Cora's opinion, for she had never been more sure of anything in her life than she was about Leroy's occupation. "As such, I could not possibly allow you to have a business of your own. What would people think? That I am not able to provide for you financially, and that you are thus forced to secure a salary for yourself?" He shook his head sadly. "I couldn't live with myself." "I'd be surprised if you could." For a long moment, Cora stared at him, wondering why she felt as though she were back in New York, seated in Mr. Connor's office. Finally, she ventured, her voice low, "I needn't be paid anything for the lessons, Leroy. I would do it for the simple pleasure of teaching the children to play an instrument that I love." "But we couldn't be sure that everyone would know that there was no financial gain to be made," Leroy pointed out. "It would hardly be polite conversation. Imagine telling Reverend Michelson, for example, that no money has exchanged hands." "No." He shook his head. "No, Cora, I'm sorry, but it's simply out of the question." Cora felt her shoulders sink, and then caught herself and took a deep breath. She couldn't allow this to bring her down, or to change her feelings about Leroy. After all, it had been little more than a passing fancy. It hadn't even been her idea, but that of Will Thompson. And what did he know? More than Leroy Harrison, her heart whispered treacherously. No, she told herself, with stern resolve. This wasn't about Will, this was about herself and Leroy, the man she was engaged to marry. And if she was to be a good wife, and follow through on her word, then she would have to accept his decision as final. If she allowed herself to dwell on that decision for one more moment, she feared she would run screaming from the room. "I heard something today," she said, forcing her voice into lightness as she changed the subject. "A few of the ladies in town were discussing it. They say that there's a rumor going around that there may be a gang of bank robbers in the area. That they may be coming here to Pinecrest. That the bank might be their next target." She took a bite and glanced up at him to see how this alternate choice of conversation had settled with him. By the dyspeptic expression on his face, it had not settled well at all. "I beg your pardon?" "A gang," she repeated. "Bank robbers. Coming here." "Outrageous," said Leroy sternly. "Who told you such a thing?" Mary Blake, Susan Hickory, Adelaide Montgomery. Well, they ought to know better than to spread rumors like that. And so, I should hope, do you? But I saw 3 strange men outside the bank, before I even heard about it, she told him, frowning. They seemed quite suspicious to me. Leroy shook his head. Nonsense, Cora. Nothing of the sort has ever happened in Pinecrest, and nothing ever will. I want you to put it right out of your mind, do you hear? There's no reason you should allow yourself to get in a tizzy over something so foolish. Cora applied herself to her supper plate with renewed vigor. There was a tizzy to be had, that much was certain, but whether it was over the rumors of bank robbers or Leroy himself, that remained to be seen. The rest of supper was very quiet, indeed. Chapter 7. Steeling herself for whatever came next, Cora raised her fist and knocked firmly on the door. After a moment, it flew open, and a woman blinked out at her with a rather vague smile of welcome. Hello? Miss Andrews? The older woman stepped out onto the veranda. The full sunlight revealed that a headful of graying dark hair, a network of crinkles and lines around her eyes, and a few other hints pointed toward an age rather north of 40. But her features were kindly, and her eyes, dark as apple seeds, smiled merrily at Cora. Don't tell me, she said. You're Cora Reed. Yes, but how? How did I know? The older woman laughed. Oh, Will told me you might be around someday. You're a pianist. A good one, Will says. Not for the first time, Cora found herself fighting a fierce blush at the mere repetition of something Will Thompson had reportedly said. He's heard me play only once, she said, demurring. Then I suppose once was enough for him to make up his mind. He's a determined young man. And it's not often that he's wrong when he decides he likes someone, too. Pearl Andrews smiled widely, doubtless noting that Cora's blush was brighter and hotter than ever. Come on in, my dear, and I'll show you the poor, neglected pile of ivory that he calls a piano. Cora didn't know if it was usual for teachers to live within the schoolhouses. She supposed that it wasn't, but Pinecrest seemed to be a law unto itself about this, as it was in so many other regards. The main room of the school was clearly set up as a classroom, with a dozen desks and chairs all facing a wall with a blackboard leaning up against it. The secondary room proved to be the bulk of Miss Andrews' personal quarters. In one corner, a small bed was half hidden behind a curtain, and a fireplace and rickety wooden table made up the kitchen space. The most readily obvious item in the room was, of course, the hulking instrument in the corner. At the sight of it, Cora couldn't help the little cry that escaped her throat. Miss Andrews nodded at her, smiling, and she ran to the instrument, running her hands over it. It lacked a cover. It also lacked several ivory keys, with only carved wooden squares taking their place. For all that, it was one of the most beautiful things she'd ever seen. I'm sure it needs a bit of repairing, the schoolteacher said, taking a seat at her table and watching Cora with avid interest. It's been badly neglected. Why, I've been the teacher here for nearly 10 years, and I don't know that more than 1 or 2 people have even ventured to touch it in all that time. And none of them knew how to play, Miss Reed, not like you. She nodded to her, smiling again. Go on. Pretend I'm not here. Cora hesitated for one moment, and one moment only. The next thing she knew, she had pulled up the needlepoint bench that clearly belonged to the piano, seated herself, and launched into a half-remembered Bach. It was awkward and ungainly, between the missing keys and the gaps in her memory, but she poured herself into it regardless, and when she at last came to a stop, fingers lingering on the keys as though unwilling to stop touching them, Pearl Andrews burst into applause. Lovely, my dear. I can tell that Will knew what he was speaking of, when he recommended your skill to me. Oh, hardly, Cora said, flushed and fiery and walking a fine line between delighted and embarrassed. It's terrible how quickly we forget. It's only been about 2 months since I was playing each and every day. I've been so afraid that I would lose my touch entirely. Well, I don't think you need have any fear of that. You come and play any time you like, Miss Reed, and I'd be glad to listen. In a burst of goodwill, Cora said, Please call me Cora. I have a feeling we're going to be friends. And you must call me Pearl. My dear Cora, we're friends already. Any friend of Will Thompson is a friend of mine. She stood and came over to the instrument, smoothing her fingers over it almost timidly. I always dreamed of learning to play, but by the time I came here and was in a room with a piano up close and personal for the first time in my life, I already had arthritis in my fingers. I knew it wasn't my fate to learn, but I reckon listening to someone play, someone who loves it as you do, is a close second. Head down, Cora found herself telling the kindly schoolteacher everything, how she had lost her position at the music hall, how she had come to be a mail-order bride, her other attempts at finding a way to play, Leroy's dismissal of her desire. And then I realized that I was near desperation, she said at last. Will had told me about you. About the piano. And I thought, surely, Leroy couldn't object to me playing all by myself, here in the schoolhouse, when the children have all gone home. As long as he doesn't mind me listening in. Cora darted a glance at the older woman, smiling. That depends. What is your opinion on bank business? My dear, I'm a schoolteacher. The question doesn't apply to me, for I haven't any money. If not for Pearl's rich chuckle, Cora would have feared that she had accidentally offended her new friend. It seemed, she thought with a smile, that Pearl Andrews was difficult to offend. On the whole, that meant they were much more likely to enjoy a pleasant friendship. Despite the dilapidation of the instrument, it still sounded sweet, and after an examination Cora was convinced that she could restore it, if not to its former glory, then at least something approximating it. As she said goodbye to Pearl and wended her way home, she felt as though she were floating, fairly over the moon with delight. All it took was one look at the face next to hers at the table to dampen that feeling. What is it, Leroy? Something's wrong, isn't it? Her mind raced even faster than her words. It isn't the bank robbers. As a matter of fact, it is just that, Leroy said sternly. Or rather, the rumors of them. Cora, will you do me the honor of answering me frankly when I ask you whether you have been speaking to others about these rumors? Cora frowned. Well, only to the ones I heard the rumor from to begin with, she said. I mean, I did tell them that I saw some suspicious-looking characters in town, that's all. I beg that you please do not try and justify yourself. Cora, do you realize what you have done? Deposits are down by 30%. 30%. There's a fear going around town, as contagious as a bad cold, and you have been instrumental in spreading it. Cora frowned more deeply. Now, Leroy, I hardly think that's fair. I didn't start the rumor. But you didn't quash it, either. I didn't know that I should. It may be more than a rumor after all. Shouldn't we at least let the sheriff know, in case worst comes to worst? It already has, in my considered opinion, Leroy said coldly. Cora, your loose lips have interfered with that most sacred subject, bank business. He tossed his napkin on the table and stood up from his chair. Indeed, it has upset me to such a degree that I cannot even partake of my supper. I hope you will consider the meaning of this, Cora. A man needs his supper, especially when he is tasked with upholding the respectability of the bank, and indeed the entirety of Pinecrest. He stalked toward the door. Where are you going? The bank requires my further attention, he snapped over his shoulder. Cora was left sitting alone in the dining room. She took in a long, deep breath. If I hadn't promised myself that I would be true to my word, she whispered. There was no point in finishing the sentence. She had promised herself. There was no going back now, no matter how unfair Leroy Harrison proved to be. What she needed was to engage in some vigorous exercise. If she went for a walk, she couldn't follow Leroy into his precious bank and throw his engagement right in his face. She was outside and moving through town before she knew it. It was a beautiful summer afternoon, the sun was headed for the horizon, and the air had begun to cool, but the long twilight lay ahead like a promise. It would have been a beautiful time to share with a handsome man whom she loved, but even the man to whom she was woefully engaged had chosen the company of his place of business over hers. She was kicking at a loose rock, head down, when the familiar voice sent equally familiar tingles running through her. Why, hello there, Miss Cora. Goin' for a postprandial stroll? She blinked at him. Yes, I suppose so. Except I didn't finish my supper. I lost the taste for it. Hello, Will. Strolling on your own, eh? Where's Mr. Harrison? Leroy, she said distinctly, is engaged in business. Will raised an eyebrow, a smile teasing at his lips. Bank business? Is there any other kind? She asked irritably. He laughed outright, and she sighed. I'm sorry, Will, I don't mean to be rude. Well, perhaps I'm better left alone for the moment, that's all. He said. Well, I reckon I won't offer you my arm, then. Besides, Mr. Harrison might not like it, should he glance out the windows of the bank and see you walkin' with another man, and a lazy rancher at that. He grinned. But I sure wish there was something I could do to ease your mind, Miss Cora. A few things flashed through her imagination in the blink of an eye. She pushed them away. Thank you, Will. You're always very kind. He tipped his hat to her as he turned to go on his way, but she couldn't help noting that there was something of a calculating look in his eye. What was it that he had in mind? What could he do to improve her spirits that he hadn't already done? That gave her an idea. It was getting rather late in the day, but Pearl had told her to come by at any time, hadn't she? And there was no time like the present. Already immensely cheered by the very prospect of the piano that awaited her, she made her way toward the schoolhouse, leaving the bank behind. Chapter 8. Another week went by, and Cora found herself shocked by the realization that her wedding was only 2 weeks away. Not that anyone would have known based on Leroy Harrison's words. He had mentioned that they would be married in a month, on the day that they had met, it was true. And that timeline was rapidly ending. But as for an actual date for the wedding, none had been set. The best that Cora could tell, Leroy had had a discussion, admittedly brief, with Reverend Michelson about when they might have the use of the chapel. Apart from this, Cora had only her assumptions and suspicions to go on. Perhaps, in fairness, suspicions was not the right word, she had to remind herself. She certainly had no reason to expect, for example, that Leroy was about to go back on his word or change his mind about their engagement. No, he seemed just as bound and determined that they would be married as she was herself. In other circumstances, perhaps that determination would have been more likely to lift her spirits. In these, however, the news that they had been invited to a small get-together to introduce Cora to the town was a welcome distraction from her own thoughts. Of course, Cora had introduced herself to just about everyone by that point, but there were a few faces whom she still did not know well, and at least some of them promised to be at the gathering. It soothed Cora's heart to hear that Pearl would be one of them. And it was just about the only thing that soothed her heart, once she arrived. It didn't take long for her companion to begin speaking at length about bank business. It wasn't all his fault, Cora thought, in all fairness. After all, a fair few of those assembled seemed just as eager to ask him about the status of the bank as Leroy was to talk about it. To her surprise, Reverend Michelson was one of those who appeared quite invested in anything that Leroy could report about the bank. Please don't think that I am overly concerned with matters of this world, he implored Cora, upon seeing the admittedly rather skeptical expression on her face. It's only that the entire funds of the congregation are in Leroy's hands for safekeeping. If not for his careful management, we would have no certainty that we'd be able to keep a roof over our head. It was just on the tip of Cora's tongue to inquire whether God himself might not have something to say about that, seeing as it was meant to be his building, when Pearl saved her from this bit of irreverence by sailing up with a wide smile for all and sundry. What a lovely gathering this has proven to be. And such a delight to have Miss Cora here with us. She put an arm around Cora in a friendly embrace, which Cora returned with a smile. She could tell by the puzzled expression on Leroy's face that he had not been aware that the two were already acquainted. Well, that was all to the better, for it meant that he hadn't any idea of the time she was spending at the schoolhouse, repairing and playing the piano. And what he didn't know about, she thought with satisfaction, he could not forbid her to do. But the next words from Pearl's mouth took her aback. Now, Cora, I have it on good authority that you're an excellent instrumentalist. You learned to play the piano as a girl, didn't you? Cora didn't dare look at Leroy. Instead, she nodded, feeling slightly faint. Yes, when I was quite young. Such a gift from the Lord, to have musical talent, don't you think, Reverend? Pearl inquired of the august personage with a genteel smile. Indeed, said the Reverend, nodding deeply. Cora risked a look at Leroy and saw that his rebuttal had been strangled during formulation. He looked as though he'd eaten something that disagreed with him. I wondered, Cora, whether you might not consent to use that talent for the good of the children. I've planned a recital just next week, and though the children are willing to perform without any music to back them, it would be much more enjoyable for everyone if there was accompaniment. Especially for those in the audience. She laughed, and those around her chuckled, too. There was just something about Pearl Andrews that would not allow a person to resist her infectious personality. It was a power that Cora was fervently glad to see used for good and not for ill. The goal of the recital, of course, is not just to entertain, but to raise money for new schoolbooks next year. Cora, Pinecrest would be grateful if you would agree to help. She darted a glance first at Leroy, whose wide eyes suggested that he had seen a ghost, and then at Reverend Michelson. And, of course, any funds left over must be donated to the church, as would only be proper, don't you think, Reverend? I do indeed, he said promptly. A capital idea. After all, music lightens the soul and soothes the savage beast, as they say. Breast, I think, Reverend, Pearl said sweetly. Michelson coughed into his glass of lemonade. Yes. Caught somewhere between wordless shock and laughing out loud, it was all Cora could do to control her expression. I do appreciate you thinking of me, Pearl, but really, I couldn't agree to do any such thing. She turned to Leroy. Our wedding is coming up soon, and I'm sure you would rather me stay attentive to such an event rather than any other, even one as deserving as this. As though on a swivel, everyone around them turned to stare at Leroy, too. He shifted uncomfortably, his face gradually turning red. Well, he said, it would only be for one afternoon, I suppose. And it is for a good cause, I suppose. Leroy. Cora cried softly. Can you mean to say that you consent to my playing the piano for the children, in public? Leroy adjusted his collar with one finger. If she had been a kinder person, Cora supposed, she might have felt more sympathy for his discomfort. But she was not. And she did not. I guess, he said at last, with less than admirable grace. Cora turned a triumphant smile on Pearl. Very well, then, she said. I'll do it. Pearl smiled back conspiratorially. You and Mr. Harrison are too generous, she said. The general hubbub of a gathering resumed, and Cora followed Pearl as she stepped a few feet away. Under the cover of the noise of conversation, she leaned close to Pearl to speak in a low tone. I don't know how you did it, but, thank you. Oh, it's nothing. Pearl chuckled. I hate to see you so frustrated, my dear. And it really would be a shame if that newly repaired piano wasn't put to good use. You really did have a recital planned, then? I hope the students won't be too caught off guard. Oh, they're ready for anything, Pearl said confidently. I did have the beginnings of a plan to do it, it's just a bit sooner than expected, that's all. Very clever of you, enlisting the support of Reverend Michelson. Cora hesitated, biting her lip, before she went on. I don't suppose that this was all Will Thompson's idea, was it? Pearl simply smiled and gave her a slow wink. The prospect of the recital, only a few days away, gave Cora renewed vigor for life in Pinecrest. The very next morning, she made her way to the school to sit in on a rehearsal. The children were eager to perform, she was glad to see, and didn't seem the least bit surprised by the suggestion. The songs they sang here in the Territories were a mix of old familiars and new folk songs that she had not yet heard. After the session, on the advice of Pearl Andrews, she made her way immediately to the Mercantile in search of sheet music. After explaining her purpose to Matthew Johnson, she was rewarded with an appreciative chuckle and an unexpected enthusiasm. Why, that sounds just fine, Miss Reed. I reckon we can scrape up what you need. I've got a little store of such things back here in these shelves. Never was too sure what good they would amount to, as no one around here has any musical inclinations, but here they are all the same, almost as though the Lord has provided. He fished the music out and laid it on the counter for her to peruse. She had to blow the dust off the top, but she was pleased to find that the songs she needed were easy enough to locate. As she searched through, Mr. Johnson continued rhapsodizing. It'll be a real treat to hear those children sing with you playin', along with Miss Reed. I'll spread the word. Especially for a good cause, I reckon everyone in town will be there to hear it. Cora smiled. It struck her that, of all who had now learned of her ability to play, the only one who seemed to have any trouble with it at all was Leroy Harrison. There, I think these will suit me just fine. She presented her chosen music to Matthew, and he solemnly rang her up at a penny a sheet. Do you really think that there will be a good turnout? For something like this, he said, it's a guarantee. Smiling to herself and clutching her precious music, she turned around and immediately locked eyes with Will Thompson, who was standing just around the corner of the aisle. They looked at each other for a long, silent moment, while Cora's heart did somersaults. At last, his familiar smile spread across his face, and he drooped one eyelid in an unmistakable wink. Feeling almost giddy, she forced herself to turn from him and head toward the door. She was almost out into the sunshine when she realized that there had been someone else nearby in the aisle, someone listening to their conversation without betraying his location. A stranger, and yet familiar in some undefined way. It was when she was halfway home that she realized where she had seen him before. He had been one of the men standing in front of the bank 2 weeks before, giving her that slight and unnerving smile. For a moment, she hesitated, wondering whether she ought to return and warn someone. Matthew Johnson, perhaps, or even Will. Or she could go straight to the bank and tell Leroy, but the result this had brought her the last time she voiced her concerns steeled her resolve, and she carried on home at once. Leroy had dismissed her worries without a second thought. Undoubtedly, he would only do the same if she spoke up again. She had had enough, she decided, of being dismissed by Leroy Harrison. Chapter 9. Mr. Johnson's prediction turned out to be accurate. Just about everyone in town turned out for the recital. There was, as Cora had had occasion to notice before, a great deal of town pride in Pinecrest, despite its size, or perhaps because of it, for everyone seemed to be related to everyone else, and no one was an outsider. A gathering of one family almost inevitably meant representatives from every other family. The dozen or so children taught by Pearl Andrews were daughters and sons, nieces and nephews, cousins or second cousins or godchildren to others in town, and the avid chatter of the audience as they settled, punctuated by laughter and cheers, reflected familial enthusiasm. Cora could not help but smile as she took her place at the piano to a spattering of applause. No, it was more than a smile, it was a beam. It was the first time she had felt such an approbation since leaving behind the concert hall in New York, and she hadn't realized until then just how much it had been missed. There were so many attendees that the piano had been moved outside into the sunshine, so the town could gather on the rather wilted lawn in front of the schoolhouse. As Pearl readied the children inside their classroom, Cora turned to watch the familiar faces of the people of her newly adopted hometown. The feeling in her heart, she realized, was pride, the same sort of pride that the good folks of Pinecrest felt. As difficult as some aspects of her life here had proven to be, she truly had grown fond of everyone she'd met. For the first time in her life, she had friends, close friends. If only, she reflected with a momentary saddening of her heart, Leroy Harrison was one of them. He had been rather silent at breakfast that morning and had left for the bank at his usual time. It had made her heart sink, even though she had tried to prepare herself for the disappointment. After his grudging approval of her playing, she oughtn't to have expected that he would attend to see it in person. And yet, somehow, she realized, she still craved his support. Almost as though her thought had called him into being, she realized that he had materialized beside her. She stared up at him for a moment in disbelief. Leroy. Why aren't you at the bank? He pressed his lips together and shook his head. I left Timothy Dean on duty, he said. Everyone else wanted to come and see the children perform, and, as the entire town was here anyway, I did not figure that there would be much cause for clerks at the bank while this shindig is occurring. Unexpectedly, a smile spread across his thin lips. "Besides, it's only right that I come to watch my bride-to-be display her skills. The good people of my town have clearly grown quite fond of you, Cora." It was an unexpected compliment, and perhaps a little lackluster, but it touched Cora's heart, nonetheless. She smiled at him and was rewarded with a thin smile in return, and, even more unexpectedly, an awkward pat on the shoulder. Then he turned to go and find a seat amidst the crowd, leaving her awash in emotion, chief among them guilt. After all, practically since she had arrived here in Pinecrest, she had harbored rather conflicted feelings toward the man she was engaged to marry. He was not all that she had dreamed of, that was certain, but was that really his fault? He was as much of a product of his time and the environment in which he had been reared as she was. He had priorities. It wasn't his fault that she did not happen to share them. It was a shame to think that bank business would always occupy his heart first and foremost, but the fact that he had left First National to be here instead, even if only for an hour or so, gave her a glimmer of hope that there was room for her in that stern, orderly heart too. If she would allow herself to be placed there. And if she did not always find herself wishing that he was someone else, instead. She turned abruptly back to the piano, feeling more guilty than ever. Pearl's timing was impeccable. Precisely when Cora needed a distraction most, the smiling teacher ushered out the children, neatly organized in 2 lines. The youngest of them was 6, the oldest 14, and they wore beaming smiles. The townsfolk burst into applause again at the sight of them, and Cora's spirits soared. There was more to life than performing in front of an audience, that much was certain, but it did lend a little zest, all the same. The children took their places. Cora lifted her fingers above the keys, smoothing them lightly with her touch, feeling quite fond of the grizzled old piano that she had worked so hard to get back into good repair. And now it would repay her efforts by sounding out into the sunshine for all to hear. She took a deep breath, watched for the signal, and when it came, began to play. At first, she wondered if something had gone terribly wrong in her efforts to repair the instrument. She could hear the strings being struck inside it, yes, but there was a different noise, much louder, that caught the attention. A sort of crack, sounding loud in the breathless hush. She frowned at the piano, dropping her hands to her lap, and the crack sounded again. "Gunshots!" cried a woman in the crowd. Instantly, the group erupted into pandemonium. Pearl, with her usual collected cool, ordered the children to march right back into the schoolhouse. Everyone was on their feet, chairs being knocked over in the tumult, and in the middle of the crowd Cora spotted the long, narrow face of Leroy Harrison, drained of all color except for 2 spots of bright red burning high on each cheek. "The bank!" he cried. Then he was off, racing with a speed that she would not have expected from him, and a courage that she would not have anticipated, either, for he was running full tilt in the direction of the bank. Heart in her mouth, she found herself racing after him, fearful that he would land himself in more trouble than he could handle. The bank was several streets away. By the time she reached the first turn, she was out of breath, but he was still going strong, yards in front of her. She paused for a moment, to gather herself, leaning against the wall of the dressmaker's shop, and turned swiftly at the sound of pounding footsteps. "Will." He clutched at her arms urgently. "Where is he?" He ran on, to the bank. "Oh, Will, what if something happens to him?" She covered her face with her hands. "I'll never be able to live with myself." When she steeled herself to look at him, she saw that his usual smile was gone completely, his well-cut lips pressed together with firm resolve. "Don't worry, Miss Cora," he said. "I'll go after him. Nothing's going to happen." To her shock, he leaned forward, covering the scant few inches between them, and she felt his lips brush her forehead. She closed her eyes, leaning into the touch, longing to reach up and wrap her arms around his neck, press her lips to his, but he was gone, and she opened her eyes to see him pelting away in the wake of the bank manager. Cora caught her breath, feeling heat on her cheeks, and started after him. Now she had not just one man to worry about, but 2. When she arrived at the bank, the showdown was already in progress. "Come on out, now." Will howled at the doors, which were wide open. Leroy was nowhere to be seen. Cora realized, with a cold chill, that he must have run inside without thinking. The glint of metal in Will's hand, she saw, was a pistol. "Don't bring any harm to anyone, and maybe you'll get away without a sentence of hanging." "You think you've got all the cards," came a strange voice from within the bank. "But I'm the one with the hostages." Will's jaw tightened. "Timothy," he called. "Mr. Harrison. Shout if you're all right." "I'm fine," Will cried, a thin voice that evidently belonged to the elderly clerk who had been left as the sole protector of the bank. "They tried to rob us, but I pulled my pistol on M. Shot one of M, too." "Shut up, old man," said the stranger, harshly. "No more talk. I'm comin' out." From the depths of the bank emerged a figure. Cora felt a shock run through her at the recognition of Leroy Harrison. Still pale, he walked with a strange awkwardness that she didn't understand until she realized that there was another man behind him, the stranger she had seen scouting the bank weeks before, the one who had given her that cold smile. Now, the bank robbery having gone south, he held Leroy hostage with a gun in his back. The rumors, it seemed, had been true. She bit her lip to keep from crying out and stepped forward beside Will. "There were 3 of them," she whispered. "There'll be another man waiting inside." He nodded, his eyes never leaving the scene in front of him. "Get on back around the corner, Miss Cora. Mr. Harrison will have my hide if I let you get hurt." She longed to tell him what she was thinking, what she was feeling, but there was danger here, and Will was facing it alone. She couldn't risk distracting him. She hid herself around the corner and peeked out, unable to stop herself from watching for what would happen next. It appeared to be a showdown. Will held his pistol at his side, eyes fixed on Leroy and the stranger. "Let him go," he said calmly. "The sheriff's on his way." The stranger sneered. "I doubt that very much," he said. "I've heard it from enough folks, including this man right here. The sheriff doesn't pay much attention at all to Pinecrest. No trouble ever happens here, they say." He laughed. "I reckon they'll change their tune after this." Will shrugged. "Believe me or don't," he said. "Your funeral." The robber's mouth snapped shut, and he glared at Will. "You're lyin', Dot. Maybe I am, and maybe I'm not. But you're thievin', and I reckon that's a greater sin." He hefted his pistol in his hand. "Now, are you going to let poor Mr. Harrison go and give yourself up?" Cora held her breath. The way the stranger's eyes narrowed, the calculating look in them, gave her the shivers. She knew what would happen next, as clearly as though it had already occurred, and as she opened her mouth to cry out to Will, the robber turned his head swiftly and shouted, "Now!" The sound of a shot rang out, and another almost on top of it. Suddenly, it was not one pistol in Will's hands, but 2. The other seemed to come from nowhere, and he held them both at arm's length, smoking from the muzzles. The stranger who held Leroy hostage was on the ground, groaning, clutching at his wounded shoulder. Will strode forward and retrieved the gun he had dropped, then glanced toward the bank for the second man. It took a moment, but then the last member of the 3-strong gang of bank robbers slumped forward on his knees, half hidden in the dark of the doorway. Leroy and Will stood face to face, and Cora watched them, frozen. It had all happened so swiftly, it was difficult to make herself believe that the danger was over, that everything had, impossibly, turned out all right. Then there was the sound of horses, galloping toward them. The cavalry had arrived, Sheriff Jones in the lead. Will's old familiar smile took its usual place. "I told you so," he said to the groaning villain on the ground. Leroy, still white as a sheet, opened his mouth. "The bank," he managed, "thanks you." And then, with no fanfare at all, he collapsed. Chapter 10. There was something of a hubbub that followed. It could even, Cora thought, be considered a kerfuffle. The first and most important matter was to ensure that Leroy was not harmed. He wasn't, he was just fine, as the town doctor assured her, but the stress and fear had taken its toll and rendered him unconscious. "If he was a woman," Dr. Parks said cheerfully, "I'd call it a swoon." "What do you call it, seeing he's a man?" she asked dazedly. The doctor scratched his head. A dead faint, I guess, he said. Reassured that Leroy would recover shortly, Cora joined the little group of heroes in the doctor's waiting room. The sheriff had managed to scrape up a posse on short notice, largely manned by Pinecrest locals who had heard the rumors of a possible bank robbery. The rumors had made their way to the sheriff's ears as well, and after a message from concerned citizens reached him, he sent word that he was on his way, just in case. Cora did not ask whether any of the concerned citizens had been Will Thompson. She did not need to. The trouble is, the sheriff was telling the room at large, we know there were 3 of the fellows. Timothy Dean here shot one of M in the arm in the initial attempt at the robbery. The ringleader is in custody, and the 3rd fellow is dead. I meant to shoot him in the shoulder, too, Will said, chagrined. Guess I aimed too low. The sheriff waved this away. You did your duty, Will, and no mistake. No one would call you to account for it. No, it's the 1st fellow who's causing the trouble. Seems he wasn't as wounded as Tim thought he was, and while all the craziness was going on outside, he scraped up what cash he could get his hands on and escaped out the window. There came a cry from the interior room. What? Cora leapt from her chair and hurried in. As she turned to close the door, she caught the glance of Will Thompson. He gave her a smile that struck her as strangely sad, especially considering the circumstances. She puzzled over it as she came to Leroy's side and helped him to sit up. What, he was saying. Did the sheriff mean what he said, Cora? Did the miscreant really abscond with the lucre? Cora blinked at him for a moment. What a strange way to put it, she murmured. Yes, I'm afraid so, Leroy. It sounds as though one of the robbers did, in fact, abscond with the lucre. Leroy's eyes were so wide that she momentarily feared that they would escape their sockets. But that's terrible. We must alert the authorities at once. The sheriff is an authority, Leroy, and he's well aware. No, not the law. The owners of the bank. They'll want to send someone out at once to investigate. Oh, my, this is terrible. He wrung his hands. It happened under my watch, and, oh, Cora, what if they remove me from my position? Cora, feeling rather at a loss, tried her best to soothe him. You couldn't possibly be held responsible, Leroy. How could you have known? But of course, he could, she thought, and closed her mouth, leaving the sentence unfinished. He could have known, for she herself had brought the rumors to his ears. The same rumors that the sheriff had heard and acted upon. The same rumors that turned out to be true. Leroy's gaze met hers, and she saw that he was thinking the exact same thing. But there was no humbling his pride. He lifted his chin and took a deep breath. If I must be punished, I shall. It's only what I deserve. Cora sighed. Leroy, please, it's only money, after all. At least, you've escaped with your life, and you might very well not have. Now, Cora, I don't think you begin to understand what is really important to me. His snappish reply left her cold. She stared at him for a moment before she managed to gather her thoughts together and put them into words. No, I'm afraid that I understand exactly what is important to you, Leroy. Bank business. It's all you've spoken about since I arrived. And I've done my best to make your interests my own. I've tried to understand what you say, and why it matters so very much. A respect which, I must say, you have not paid to me in return. He stared at her. Why, I don't know what you mean. Music, Leroy. Music is important to me, it always has been, and the longer I live without it, the more I miss it. Every step I took to keep it in my life, you have put your foot down and refused. You say that it reflects badly on you. Well, I think it reflects badly on you as a husband to pay so little attention to his wife's interests. The entire town was assembled to watch me play, Leroy, and only then did you consent to allow me. Allow me. We aren't even married yet, Leroy, and you have no right to say that I cannot play the piano when and where I please. The outburst left her a little embarrassed, especially when she realized that everyone in the waiting room might well have heard it. But it had needed to be said, and she also felt a bit euphoric. She came to a stop at last, and they simply stared at each other. Leroy took a deep breath. "Well," he said. Cora held her breath. Shouting at the man who was going to be her husband was, perhaps, not the best thing to do, especially after the ordeal he had just endured. But if they were going to be married, it was best that they understood each other. Perhaps now that she had been so forthright with him, she told herself, he would be more understanding of her. Still, her hope felt as though it were sinking. "Well," said Leroy again. "I suppose you're right, Cora. You do understand me, and I do not understand you, not even in the slightest. But I can admit that I have made a mistake in attempting to ward off your devotion to music. It was wrong of me to think only of myself." He nodded. "Yes, and with this new understanding, I feel quite free in saying that our union is, perhaps, not the best idea." Cora gaped at him. "I beg your pardon?" Yes. It's all one big misunderstanding, really. Perhaps I'm not as ready for marriage as I thought. But you, my dear, you might very well be." He gave her a strange half-smile. It looked almost fond. "But not to me." "Are you telling me that you are ending our engagement?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe the words out loud. He reached over and, for the very first time, took her hand. "I am," he said. "And don't pretend that you're not happy about it, Cora. Do me the favor of honesty. We're better off as friends as we would ever be as man and wife." "Or, perhaps, as mere acquaintances," Cora said, but she couldn't stop herself from smiling. She squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Leroy. And you, Cora. You'll stay here in Pinecrest, won't you? I'm sure that I will see you around on bank business," Cora filled in, her smile growing wider by the moment. She leapt to her feet, stopping herself from embracing him only by a narrow margin. Thank you, Leroy. Yes, I accept your dissolution of our engagement." Excuse me, won't you?" He nodded, smiling, and she practically leapt from the room. The sheriff and a few other men remained in the waiting room, but Will was nowhere to be seen. She ignored their knowing looks and raced for the door. "Will." She saw his familiar, stalwart figure, poised to turn the corner. He turned to look at her instead. She ran toward him, half stumbling in her excitement, and took his hands in hers. "Will." He smiled down at her, but there was still a hint of sadness there. "How's Mr. Harrison?" "Leroy?" "Oh, he's just fine." "Just fine." She laughed, feeling giddy. "As stubborn as ever." Will chuckled too. His eyes were full of warmth. "There you go again," he said. "That's what I love about you, Miss Cora. You're a straight shooter, and you tell it like it is." He caught himself, as though the words had escaped him without his permission, but it was too late. It felt as though her heart had suddenly stopped in her chest, as though time had stopped from moving around them. You love me?" Will Thompson opened his mouth, then closed it again without speaking. Incredibly, she saw a blush appear on his tanned cheeks. It was the first time that she had seen him rendered speechless, but it didn't last long. Yes, he said finally. I didn't intend to say it quite like that. After all, you're an engaged woman, and have been since I met you. So, I was wrong to let my heart yearn after you." He smiled now, looking helpless. But it was determined to do just that, regardless. "I guess Leroy Harrison isn't the only stubborn one around here." She gazed up at him with a heart full of happiness. "Would it make you feel any better, Will, to hear that Leroy just ended our engagement?" His eyes widened so dramatically that she laughed and wound her arms around his neck. "Do you know," she said conversationally, "that I was absolutely bound and determined to get married when I came here to Pinecrest. But now that I'm here, I suppose I'm not particular about who to." He was smiling in overjoyed disbelief as she leaned up to kiss him, and returned her embrace with a love she could feel, a love she could believe. At last, he let her go and leaned his forehead against hers. "I love you, Cora. Everything about you. I love it all." "And I love you, Will Thompson," she whispered back. Everything. He said, smiling that honest, handsome smile again. What's next, then? Next. She stepped back and slipped a hand in his. There was only one word for it, she knew. Next, I suppose, a duet. Together, they walked down the main street of Pinecrest, the summer sun overhead lighting their path. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.